the first thing that Roosevelt did was close all the banks by executive order. No president had ever done anything like this. He didn't just close the private banks, he closed the Federal Reserve Bank, which thought of itself as a power unto itself. He ordered the Federal Reserve Bank, in particular the New York Federal Reserve Bank, to close. The New York Federal Reserve refused to close. Roosevelt sent a message to the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, who was a former head of the Morgan interest, and he said, close the bank or I will close it and there will be federal troops to do so. The bank closed. That was not merely a statement of saying I'm against the Fed or something like that. He was asserting the power of the executive of the United States, the chief executive of the United States, and the federal government over the financial system by doing that. And then what he did is he sent examiners into the bank and reorganized the debt of the bank, the speculative debts of the bank. What he did is he had the examiners take things which Wall Street declared as worthless and declare those things as being of real value. The things that Wall Street declared as worthless were all the closed factories, all the mortgage farms which had no value to Wall Street because Wall Street couldn't sell the financial paper. So he said, those things are real assets, and I will, as opposed to the bailouts going on, I will give money from the Treasury to these banks as secured by these assets for the purpose of stemming the fear of the American people that their money is not good. If I don't do this, their money isn't good. So he did this, and he rescued the banking system. And what he said afterward is, people came to me pleading, save me, said the bankers to me. And then I did save them. And I'm reminded of the story of a man walking along a pier, a banker walking along a pier with a silk hat, and he falls into the water and he's saved by a worker that's walking along the pier. He pulls him out. And then afterwards, the banker tells the worker, well, wait a minute, you didn't save my silk hat. And that's what he says. He says, I will not save the silk hats of Wall Street. I am saving the banking system for the American people, so that the American people, I can now use that system to mobilize a recovery. So why don't we go through here and think about what we're talking about, because we're on the edge of something much worse than this. We are on the edge of a blowout that will make the Depression look like something, it won't be a cakewalk, because it wasn't a cakewalk, but it will be something that will pale, the Depression will pale before this. Because what we're on the edge of is the extermination of the entire financial system under the weight of a massive speculation. And right now, we're without a Roosevelt. All right, first of all, they've recently done a PBS, it's a PBS documentary that went through this. It actually used some material that I had written. They'd actually asked for the material, and they used some of it. Once it was realized, there was a famous statement that's alleged to have been made by J.P. Morgan, and the statement went something along the line is, that son of a bitch has betrayed us, about Roosevelt. They had thought that Roosevelt could be controlled because he sort of was of them. He was of a patrician class. They believed that he thought like them, but obviously from everything you're seeing and you're going to hear, he absolutely didn't. And when they realized that they couldn't control him, something happened. And it's this: there was an assassination attempt. And there's no explanation for how this thing was ever organized. It was by pure accident that Roosevelt was not killed prior to his inauguration. Now, understand what that would have done. If Roosevelt was killed before he was president, there's no president, right? You haven't sworn in a new president, so the vice president is not the successor to the president. You're creating a constitutional crisis at the moment that the country is in the grave crisis. This was part of a process that was to lead towards chaos, and ultimately, because they were saying, well, maybe Hoover would continue, but then there would have been a popular revolt. They were already stoking the fire at the time that this was done to organize a Mussolini-like fascist coup in the United States, which was going to involve the use of former veterans, the so-called bonus army, which emerges later and continues even after this fails. But this was the first blow in this, and it's important to recognize that most people don't even know that this happened. You can read through history books, and you will not see in history books in schools that President Roosevelt was almost assassinated. When I say almost, if a woman with a purse had not moved the arm of the assassin, Roosevelt would have been dead. As it was, he wasn't wounded. And instead, the mayor of Chicago was hit, Anton S.D.Mack, and he died. Right? He died.
To come here would be open. They do describe to you what you would have seen, which is FDR took the oath of office on the Roosevelt family Bible, open to a verse in St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. That's Corinthians 1:13, which is that though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and hath not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. Okay, and it goes on and so on. Brahms has a famous song in his 4 serious songs, which is the last one of these. But when he took the oath of office, this was opened. And when he took the oath, he took it on that section of the Bible. What's important about that is that that's the basis of Roosevelt's idea of the general welfare principle of the Constitution. Okay, so it was one idea. And it's important because while people talk about this idea of the separation of church and state, there is not a separation, nor should there be a separation between morality or the conception of the human mind, the human self, right, and the actions of a government.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole point of self-government. It has to proceed from somewhere. And so in the case of Roosevelt, this is what the situation was.
And his understanding of the word charity is not the common sense of somebody's going to say, well, it means he's going to hand gold to somebody that needs it, right? In other words, the common idea of what charities are. His concept of charity was this higher principle in which I am responsible for you. I am responsible for your well-being. Your well-being is my well-being. It's not about money at all. It's not about giving anybody anything. It's a sense of responsibility. And he evoked this several times during his political campaigns to speak on this principle of charity. And he said that the problem with the previous administration was that it was frozen in indifference, that it could not see its people and understand them. All it cared about was Wall Street. This is a brief presentation in their mind of what Roosevelt did in the first 100 days and in the New Deal as a whole. It's presented as a series, as if what the mistake is it's presented as if it's a series of things, right? As opposed to what it really was. Because a common line on Roosevelt was, well, what he did is he did a lot of things, but he sort of did them all ad hoc. Whatever came to his mind, then first we had this, and then we did that. Social Security, he always wanted to do, he waited to do it. Then they had, the works programs, and they approved the works programs. They said, no, it wasn't. This was a thoroughgoing change, which starts, and that's appropriate that they put it here, with a financial reform. But it is not a reform. It is a reassertion of a principle. The principle, the single most important principle of the American system of physical economy, the system of Alexander Hamilton, the system of Henry Carey and Lincoln, and the system of Roosevelt. That is the principle of credit, right? The idea of taking the power of Wall Street and its control over the issuance and purposeful distribution of credit and placing the government as a means to direct credit for what is needed, right? Roosevelt didn't abolish the Federal Reserve, and a lot of people say, well, he should have done that. It was his decision, probably could have, but it was his decision that what he was going to do is he was going to focus on what needed to be done and not give the enemy, which was Wall Street, an opportunity for a big fight that could bollocks everything up. Now, that's what he thought. He probably should have changed the Federal Reserve. In fact, he needed to change the Federal Reserve. But what he did is instead, is he put into the Federal Reserve, for the first time and the only time, a non-banker, an industrialist from Utah named Marina Eccles. And Marina Eccles believed in the New Deal and in the principles of the New Deal. So as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he sort of tried to work with it, but you can't really work with it because it's a bunch of stupid bankers, right, other than him. So they constantly did this. But the most important single thing that he did was first, what I told you, to assert the power of the federal government, saying that the government's power in response to the needs of the people, the general welfare, includes the right to regulate, control, and distribute credit regardless of what Wall Street thinks. That the power of the government is above Wall Street. Okay, so what he did as part of the first wave of what he was doing is that he created the famous Glass-Steagall Act, right, which was put through as part of the Banking Act. And what it did is it did three things. It established a program of deposit insurance, the FDIC, to ensure the people's deposits, that provided banks operated properly and provided they were dutifully chartered, and under this system, the federal government would guarantee the deposits of common people up to a certain amount of money. At that point, it was $10,000, right, which was an enormous amount of money in the Depression. But there was a price for this. The price for this is the explicit statement that those deposits could not be speculated with. That's over. And that's what Glass-Steagall did. It prevented gambling with the people's money. And then it had another important provision, which it said anybody that violates this law, any banker that violates this law is subject to federal criminal penalty, meaning jail. So it had three elements to it. Jail for those bums who wanted to break the law, and deposit insurance, but to guarantee the deposits of the people and not for speculation. This is the law that has to come back right now, immediately. Yesterday, it was dismantled over a period of time and finally kicked to the curb in 1999 at the request of Citibank and some other people. And this has opened the door to the unbridled speculation of today and creates by removing this concept of only insuring the people's deposits and allowing for the conduct of banking as part of the issuance of credit for productive purposes. By breaking that bond, you've created a casino in which there's no risk. Roosevelt would have fought to the death to prevent that from happening. The other reforms that were done were not as significant because they were regulatory. This was a reform on the basis of principle. All the other regulations, including the various securities acts, and the various other financial reforms were regulatory and necessary, right? Establishing agencies to oversee, but they were not of the same character. Glass-Steagall is a question of principle, and that principle is central to everything else Roosevelt is doing, because he recognizes that the enemy of prosperity is money and the belief in the power of money. And he did everything in his power to take that away from people, that belief, and give them a different sense of what they're about. The Wall Street had cut off credit, especially after he did this. They stopped lending to anybody. They didn't lend to companies to expand. They didn't lend. There was no basis for having, any kind of hope that people would be productively employed. They couldn't be productively employed because nobody was creating jobs. So as part of this general welfare principle, it was incumbent upon the federal government to initiate programs to get things done, to put people to work. And that's what he's doing. Now, there's what he's doing as best he can, because the need is greater than the ability to organize the programs. He's trying to build public infrastructure, which is also a concept that is central to the Hamiltonian system of the American system. In other words, the government's responsibility to create the infrastructure that's necessary for the functioning of the economy, not merely in the present, but with an eye towards the future. It was about putting people to work. Why? Because for that meant people had hope. And unless you have hope, you can't build a future. And that's what Roosevelt was intent on doing.
How was he able to extend credit if he was going against the Federal Reserve in the very beginning?
Well, because the Federal Reserve he understood something about the Constitution. Credit, the federal government, the issuance of money, right, as we call it money, the dollar, right, the paper dollar, is an instrument of credit.
Right.
It has the full faith and backing of the United States, not the Federal Reserve. You might say it's a Federal Reserve note, but what makes it valuable is that the government of the United States and the people of the United States stand behind that. And what he recognized is that the Constitution says not that the Federal Reserve issues credit, not that the Federal Reserve controls credit, that the Treasury of the United States, under the direction of the President of the United States, with the approval of the Congress of the United States, issues credit. That's how he did it. So Roosevelt requested, and with the help of one of the greatest senators that this state ever had, Robert Wagner, drafted legislation that restored the balance between ownership and working people, and allowed for the organization of trade unions, and federally protected that right. Now, you asked about Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a great man in organizing industry, and one of the stupidest people in thinking about economics that ever lived. I mean, he had an innate understanding of the importance of how to organize labor to be productive in terms of organizing the factory floor and the use of machinery. He had no idea about what actually is the source of creativity. And the source of creativity is the mind, the creative powers, not only of the manager of the factory, but of all the working people, which requires that their rights be guaranteed. Roosevelt understood this. So this is a picture of union organizing, CIO, the Congress of Industrial Unions, headed at that point by Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, and John L. Lewis, are organizing to unionize the Ford, which is one of the more recalcitrant organizations. All the other makers were organized before that. And so there was bitter fights over this. And eventually, Ford had to accede, as everybody else did, to the power not of the unions, that's a mistake, but the power of the federal government to guarantee the rights of workers as a responsibility of that government under the General Welfare Clause. Everything that I will tell you will prove the point that everything that Roosevelt was doing was from the basis was in the Constitution, in that principle, because this is perhaps the biggest lie There are many lies. That this is one of the biggest lies that are told about him. Roosevelt is identified, especially by members of the conservative orientation and economists who think in the terms of von Mises and von Hayek of the Vienna School, as the proponent of so-called Keynesian economics, which is the printing of money and putting the money into circulation as the basis for improving everything, improving the economy. No. And that the common line is that Roosevelt created these massive debts, he put people to work, and employment went down. And then what happened is, well, there was a limit on this, the debt started rising, government programs had to be cut back, and unemployment started to rise again, and people's income started to decline. And so this all proves that Roosevelt was illusory. What he did was illusory. He really didn't do anything.
We'll get to the last part. Was the only reason that this didn't completely collapse was
Good war. No, I was just about to say that. Then the only thing that saved his butt was the war. Otherwise, there would have been a new depression. Now, you have a number of people. Bill O'Reilly wrote this. I'm trying to think of more modern people that wrote. Elliot Janeway is the first guy that really wrote this stuff. But that's back in the 70s, and everybody picked up the same argument. And that's a popularization of this. Look, there's a different principle at work. Keynes wrote all of these tomes. If you want to one night bore yourself, you can't sleep, and you want to bore yourself to death, you can start reading his general theory. Roosevelt was asked, it was written in approximately 1936, and Roosevelt was asked at a press conference. Well, I mean, we see that Lord Keynes has issued his new massive work, and this should be a good thing for you. Have you read it yet? And Roosevelt said, no, but I understand that it makes a good doorstop. It was a big book. Roosevelt was not a Keynesian. He was a hybrid of many things, but mostly an American system believer, a believer in the principle of the general welfare, and a believer in the power of the government to serve the general welfare through the use of credit, which makes him a Hamiltonian, even though he didn't often talk about Hamilton, except to present a big award for about Hamilton in the late 1930s, because Hamilton was a New Yorker, like Roosevelt. He was not interested in spending money. What he was interested in was building the country and building prosperity. In the case of the Keynesians, they didn't care what you give it to, just give it to anybody, right? Create programs, hand out money in the street if you want. They even say that, Keynes even says that would be an effective program. And he also says that if you really want to understand how to regulate my program, well, look at the way the Germans are doing it, right? And that the American should go in that direction. In other words, you have a more austere government that regulates the issuance of these things. But what is Roosevelt doing? Roosevelt is giving specific funding for directed programs. They're not random. They're for building a post office, building an airport. They're for building huge dams. They're for providing backing and credit for the TVA, for expanding factories. Okay. So his program is Hamiltonian. The debt is issued and can be liquidated by what?
By the productivity of what?
The future productivity.
Oh.
It's all about the future. And there's that cartoon that's on that other wall over there where it says the debt is expanding, but don't worry, it's going to melt. It is going to melt in the future as the productivity that is created by the investment. This is not, you are investing in the American people and their economy. That's what Roosevelt's doing. It's wrong to look at it as merely spending. It is an investment. We don't have the means right now, given all of this, to just simply issue more credit. But Wall Street won't lend. Wall Street cut off the credit to the American people, to their factories and everything, and we're trying to orchestrate a new depression.
Is it fair to say that Wall Street and the major banks even orchestrated the 29 collapse?
No, that's a little bit different. They didn't orchestrate it. They collapsed in the same way that what's happening now is going to collapse as a product of their speculation.
So you'd say the top bankers didn't want it to collapse, they could buy up everything for pennies on the dollar and then have more.
But they did that, but they didn't want the result that occurred, which almost bankrupted all of them. Had Roosevelt not built Grand Coulee and the other dams of the West, there's no war production possible in California or Seattle or anywhere else. If Roosevelt had not improved and built the rail and highway infrastructure, there's no means to transmit the goods to port. If he had not expanded the Port of New York and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, do I need to go on? In other words, all the infrastructure that he invested in was necessary to win the war. And that yet people say Roosevelt just did this as a, on his, willy-nilly. No, he already knew, and there's stuff that he wrote privately and otherwise. By 1935, and possibly even 1934, he already knew that the United States was going to have to fight a war. So he was preparing the country, but you don't prepare the country, right? By closing, having all its factories closed and shut down, taking the machinery out and selling it for scrap. In other words, that it's the interest of all the people that people should remain immiserated in colonial poverty, while Britain took the wealth of these nations for their own benefit. That he never agreed with, nor did he agree with it in France, nor did he agree with it in Holland. Even though he could talk and try and organize. He believed, by the way, that the King of England could be organized far more easily than Winston Churchill. Was a much more pompous colonialist than even the king was. And then the other thing that he did is they said, well, look, this is, the king is coming, we have to have an important banquet, right, with, the best, we'll bring out all the servants, and this is what his mother wanted. They organize everybody, get dressed up, and they have to have formal evening dress and so forth and so on. Roosevelt said, no, let me take care of this. So what he organizes is a barbecue, then they have hot dogs.
In the yard.
And he's doing this for a purpose. He's not trying to embarrass the king. He's trying to explain the difference between an American and a subject of the king. We treat you with respect because of who you are. We like you, you're okay. He did, he said, I like you, you're a good guy. He said, despite some of the things that your people in your name do, he said, I like you. He said, but we do not have to bow to you. We're equals. Not me as president, but any person. And he brought over the person who was serving, a black servant, who was serving the hot dogs. He says, here, I want you to meet the king. That Roosevelt, the image of Roosevelt as an autocrat, as somebody who doesn't care about the people, who just is doing things because he has the power to do so. It's all wrong. It's all wrong. The reason the American people love this man like they loved no other president in the last century, even Kennedy. Kennedy they admired the guy, but the love for Roosevelt was palpable, right? You saw it in the movie, what people were saying. I mean, people cried at his death, not people in the ones or twos or tiers, millions of people. He was regarded in the same way as George Washington was. He was their father, the father of their country, the person who took care of them, the person who cared about them. And no more, not just caring for them as dumb slobs. He believed that it was the responsibility of the President of the United States to educate the American people. So the people of the United States have grown stupid, in part because we've had stupid presidents who can't educate anybody, and what they do is they speak above or through people, but never in the way that Roosevelt did. And it's from this room, organized, it's not actually the room obviously, but he's organized in this way, that Roosevelt would speak. And he enjoyed doing this. No other president before him had ever used the mass media. And what he's found, he said, look, this is how I can directly address the American people. I don't need to address it through the mirror of the media. In other words, some media person reporting a chunk of what I'm saying. They're going to hear 15, 25 minutes from me on any number of topics. And then you saw those letters as you walked in. When you go back out, you see them again. Roosevelt received more mail than any other person in that time in history. In history, in this speech. In this speech, Roosevelt has made a conceptual breakthrough in which he is presenting the common aims of mankind as in a way in which every American and anybody listening to him can understand. And most importantly, he is redefining the responsibility of American citizenship as being a citizen of the world, responsible for the world as a whole, that the United States exists in a world system, not some capitalism, communism, but a system which is the entirety of the world. And the United States has a particular role to play within that system, which is to guarantee the principles of progress for all mankind. And those principles are defined in his mind by these four freedoms. And this is an illustration of them by the artist Norman Rockwell, which appeared on the successive covers of the Saturday Evening Post in 1941. Now, the idea to hear, if you hear him deliver this speech, what you hear him say in cadence is that these principles hold true, this holds true for everyone, everywhere in the world. He repeats it 4 times to make it clear that this is not about America, but we are going to fight a war to create this world. This is the future. This is what you're fighting for. Not to save the United States, but to reinvigorate the principles of the United States that have founded the United States and the whole world. So these are the 4 freedoms. You should learn these things, because if you keep these in your mind, you will understand more about who you are and what your responsibility is as a citizen in this country, and your responsibility to the rest of the world. It's the right to express ideas without restriction. And that's what he's talking about. Freedom of worship means that we are all able to understand God and the function of God as a moral God and a moral guidance in the universe. But we cannot restrict people and tell them how to interpret that. That is a matter of individual conscience, and it's individual conscience and moral responsibility which drive progress. That doesn't mean handing out money to buy food. I mean, that's sort of what he's showing here, something like that. What it means is that poverty in the world, anywhere in the world, and if you remember the statements of Martin Luther King, right? The same kind of statement. Poverty anywhere in the world, the lack of freedom anywhere in the world, means that we are less free, that we are more poor. So poverty as a concept must be eliminated. And then the final one. And this is the one that Rockwell probably got wrong, because I think he probably understood it, but probably the Saturday Evening Post didn't want it said. Roosevelt, when he talks about this, he says what it means. That means an end to permanent militaries, an end to militarism, an end to the creation of military power as a means to settle arguments among nations, and more importantly, the whole idea of the need to fight each other is over. There is a higher concept of sovereignty, a sovereignty in which nations cooperate while people respect their rights to do things within those nations, totally contrary to what the world that we see right now, where we believe we have the right to go around and change people's governments, but we have no responsibility for those people to make those people prosperous. There's an effort to construct the argument that the United States has a special relationship with Great Britain, and that the authorship of that special relationship was Franklin Roosevelt. There was no special relationship that extended beyond what was the conduct of the war. That Roosevelt cooperated with Churchill, even though, despite the fact that Churchill sabotaged a number of things, including the Second Front, attempted to sabotage aid to the Russians, denied Roosevelt information that the British had about the location of the Nazi concentration camps when he knew that Roosevelt intended to bomb the railheads and stop the slaughter that Roosevelt had come to understand was taking place. All of those things, Roosevelt still maintained a cordial and friendly relationship with Churchill on the conduct of the war and the conduct and the effort to construct a durable peace. But he did not and never did compromise on this question of the liquidation of the British Empire. In fact, the book that, if you haven't read it, you should read it, is Elliott Roosevelt's book, As He Saw It, which is a first-hand description of the interchanges between Roosevelt and Churchill by Roosevelt's son, who was present at these meetings as an aide. And he, under the direction of his mother, wrote a book to state what Roosevelt believed about Churchill and about the British Empire in particular. And because Roosevelt had a vision, and what prevented that vision from coming into being was not so much a fault in what he thought he could accomplish as much as it was a fault in what he thought would be his life. He died. And because he died, the world is the way in which it is now, and not the way in which Franklin Roosevelt envisioned it. So that becomes our responsibility to change that. Based upon the strength of the American economy and the depletion of German resources in the Russian front, and also the isolation of Japan in Asia, and the penetration of other forces surrounding Japan, that both the war was going to end in victory. So the only question was how to secure that victory, was to have the war ended. I mean, the idea was to end the war as efficiently as possible with the least amount of loss of life, which meant that the earliest possible launching of the Second Front. Churchill delayed the launching of the Second Front, according to some people, based upon an assessment of Roosevelt's medical condition. He intended that the war should last until Roosevelt died. And to do that, he resisted even though a front could have been launched and was launched. In other words, there was a front launched in North Africa, which could have been questioned. You could have diverted those resources. The Germans in North Africa weren't doing anything except threatening British assets.
MacArthur points to Churchill wanting to divert the forces in the Pacific to India.
Right, to India, to defend
Crown
India from something that's never occurred. There was never an attack on India. The Japanese had no intention of attacking India. So Churchill delayed the end of the war. It was a constant battle, and he did this with the idea of both bleeding the resources of the Russians and also attacking. That the extension of the war attacked Roosevelt's health. You go through. Roosevelt should not survive the war to create the peace, and he got his way. But it was possible that the second front could have been launched at the latest in 1943, and more likely could have even been launched at the end of 1942, once things were secured in the Pacific. And Roosevelt campaigned throughout the country, even though his doctors had told him, don't do this. Roosevelt had attempted and had gotten an agreement from Stalin to have this meeting in Canada, but Churchill rejected that.
Oh my God.
And so this part of the thing is true, that not the first part, that Roosevelt suffered greatly on this trip, including the loss of his great friend Paul Watson, who died of a stroke on the ship, which really rocked him.
Oh.
I mean, he was perhaps his closest actual friend in the political sphere, and Roosevelt went. This happened as he was going there. As he was returning. Now, you're post-war, which nobody comprehends now, because of what happened. What happened, everybody knows: the Cold War, near wars, the Korean War, confrontation, threats, and to the edge of general thermonuclear war. Not one, not two, not three, not four, but 6 times the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked first President Eisenhower and then John Kennedy to launch a general thermonuclear war against Russia. That is the world as it was, as it happened, but it's not the world that Roosevelt conceived, and it's not the world he would have made. His world was a world that that actually demobilized the United States, that there was a bring down of the American military. That never happened. There was a reconversion of some of the war industries. Obviously, you couldn't have people driving around in old cars, so they reconverted some of the war industries. But the United States came out of the Second World War with a permanent military establishment. Contrary to everything in our Constitution, contrary to what Roosevelt wanted. And more importantly, it came out in a construct of a world designed by Churchill, the concept of an Iron Curtain. Stalin's reaction to the death of Roosevelt was to state that I have no partner. Now, understand what that means. Roosevelt had convinced Stalin, who has a completely different system, right? It is a communist system, don't call it anything else. It is not the American system, and it doesn't really work, and it doesn't really function. But Stalin believed that Roosevelt was not his enemy, and that the United States was not his enemy. That is clear from everything he wrote, and also everything that Roosevelt wrote about their correspondence and what he believed. He believed that these were two people who did not think the same way, but were not adversaries. That they could build a certain kind of view of what the world should be. And the world that they envisioned was a world in which there would be cooperation around development. But what he wanted was a global development bank, which he called the World Bank. But the stupid people in our own delegation focused on the IMF system and monetary, and the arrangements between currencies. And when Keynes lost the fight on how this was going to be whether it would be a gold reserve system or an actual gold-based system, which is what he was arguing for, and or a system of similar to what we have now, a floating exchange rate system. Those were the 3 options, Keynes pushing the last one. When he lost that fight, he focused on the World Bank, and he wrote into the World Bank clauses that said the World Bank could not lend for large-scale development projects. So Roosevelt was stymied, but he said, don't worry about it, I know how to fix this. But he didn't know how to fix this because he died. He didn't fix it, and it stayed. So there were no mechanisms created for the global distribution of credit, which Roosevelt had made the priority. But this was what he wanted to do. The United Nations was never intended to be a world government. It was intended to be something completely different. It's intended to be what this BRICS arrangement sort of is now, a mechanism for nations to come together to decide on policies of the mutually beneficial policies of development, that you could discuss issues. It wasn't a question of government, it's a question of this higher concept of sovereignty. And Roosevelt certainly understood its intent wasn't the dismantling of the colonial system, which he wanted to do, and the policy of replacing economic and political colonialism with development of nations. That didn't happen. Now, does that mean that the policy was misguided? No. It means Roosevelt died. So people are ex post factoing, right, if that's a word, coming back and saying, well, look what happened. Obviously, he failed. No, he died. He didn't fail, he died. And Churchill played a large role in killing him.